I would consider to be one of the biblical elements for marriage.
Someone said, "What happened to the service?"
Making decisions and choices together. That's something that probably is a little bit untypical today. And of course, there's such a scope and variety of culture and education in our country today, in our civilization today. A lot of times you have one person
Calling all the shots.
calling all the shots, leading the family in a certain direction. The husband and wife should be working together in that regard. It shows a mutual sign of respect.
That'll be more interesting to discuss further as well as we get to the topic of like the husband being the head of the house and stuff like that too.
Right. Well, obviously there are certain God-ordained roles that each must play. But you have to, again, you should value the input from someone else and who would have the vested interest in your well-being more than your other half. Who would have the vested interest in the family more than the other half of you. So, people go to counselors all the time, but even and of course, some people obviously need that, but that outside entity is not going to have the same vested interest that you would have in the direction the family should go or the priorities the family should have. That's why it's a tragedy that the government would try to step in to, marriages and the bedroom and step into invade the life of the family unit the way that they have in the past. That's a tragedy. It should never be allowed.
Yeah, because they're not part of that union.
Right. It's an outside entity. And, governments want to take you in the direction they want you to go, that they think you should go. But they, the philosophy that they believe in. Of course, we all know that that's as corrupt as it can be in every government. So very much the family union is, which makes up society, should have the greatest voice, but unfortunately, lobbyists are taking care of that.
Okay, so the next question there is, what does it mean that they were naked and not ashamed?
Not self-conscious. That's a very unusual place to be at, because as human beings we are all very self-conscious. But that meant they were looking more at each other than they were looking at themselves. That's true.
So to be fair, let's be fair here.
Well,
Yeah,
the
just them
animals,
two.
the animals, of course, are covered with fur, right? With scales or whatever. So all of the other living things had covering. Of course, the Bible, we're told that, not so much here in Scripture, but Rose just got on the left. I wanted her to comment on her study on the robe of light.
But I have a harder time because when I get close to there, it changes the audio. I'm so close that the microphone picks me up really loud. Picks up every keystroke. If I tap on the keys to answer somebody, it picks up the tapping.
Well, the thing of it is, the Bible uses the term there, we're naked. I don't know what I can't remember what the Hebrew word is for that.
Hebrew word.
If it just means, without
I can grab it right here.
It's arom.
Right, that's a mouthful. If they had a robe
It's
of
the
white,
same word twice?
they had a robe of
Oh, just
white.
the word arom.
Yeah, but it said that it was listed twice there when I looked it up too.
I guess it's also there in the sense because you can think of a child, they were run naked outside and no one didn't care.
Right.
And once they lost,
We well know that.
yeah. And once they lost that innocence, they realized that they were naked and they felt ashamed to be naked in front of each other. But like a child is innocent, they will be naked all day and people will see them naked and they won't care. But then their clothing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you know, with maturity comes responsibility.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's like, you know, they didn't even know they didn't even try to hide until they ate the fruit.
yeah, in a sense, they were, let's just say, innocent
Until they knew what was
and
wrong.
young, of course, but I think they've been in the garden for 6 years. But they have this robe of light.
Just throw that in there.
They have this robe of light, right? So even that is going to,
Scott says they had a garment of light or righteousness that made them not ashamed.
right, yeah. So again, I think that really hinges on,
But yet they
Moses'
still,
point there, the innocence.
but they still knew that they were naked.
I guess
But
it
maybe-
didn't-
They didn't have any exterior covering. And of course, Moses is the one.
I see. Maybe that's what it is.
commenting on
Maybe
it.
it's just that this is Moses' account. Maybe they were actually clothed with like light, and they couldn't actually see each other because of their faces, I guess.
Right, but he knew that they didn't have skins on like he was there,
Yeah.
or
Fur, skins,
fur
Little bit.
skins.
Yeah.
So basically, they weren't covered with anything that like they were covered with when he was writing the account. So, I think it really highlights the innocence, the sinlessness, and if there were no sin, people would still be wearing a robe of light. Man.
Be naked
I mean,
right now.
I don't know. In the new earth, what are they going to be? In the new earth, what are they going to be wearing? Right?
Yeah, nothing.
You know.
No.
Hopefully, it'll be that robe of light, and there'll be no issue.
But there's nothing can come between us and God.
Yeah, but you know, but what is kind of interesting, bless you, is that it talks about how martyrs have that red hem around their garment,
Right.
around their robe of righteousness.
Right.
So I guess it's like a non-physical yet visible thing that covers you. It'd be interesting to look more into that.
Then I guess it's also there's no point to be or to have the robe other than to be marked by God. Because like everything's perfect now, there's no reason to even need clothing.
Yeah, I don't see in heaven there's going to be in the new earth, big manufacturing facilities cranking out
T-shirts. and-
Levi jeans and T-shirts and that kind of thing. Trench coats.
trench coats.
Different women's fashion.
Yeah.
Do I want the slightly brighter robe of light today, or
And
the
it
lesser
changes.
bright light?
Yeah, and it changes every. Every millennial it changes. To a new style.
Gotta flip the switch and put it on dim when you're feeling romantic.
Then it turns like pink and like dim.
Well, we look at things from our own perspective, of course. If you go to other cultures, other countries, they're not as
Modest.
yeah, they're not as modest. The modesty is you can go to other countries, and in the summertime, if they're out there swimming, a lot of times the women aren't wearing just a bottom, not even wearing a top. So, but nobody thinks a thing of it.
Yeah.
Apparently, because it's just cultural or something like that.
We also have stuff like nude beaches in America. And
Scott says fig leaves couldn't cover sin, so an animal sacrifice was required. Thus, animal skins were provided by God. And the word that's used in Genesis for the animal skins is the word for covering, is the word overcoat, which meant it covered them completely.
Coverall.
And of course, I think that was also an illustration.
It's not the Fred Flintstone thing with the little skimpy
Yeah.
mini stuff. This was a complete covering that probably
Right.
covered them from the shoulders to the ankles,
Yeah.
like the robe of light had covered them.
The reform dress.
Mhm.
Yeah, and of course, to cover is a definition of atonement. Is to cover.
Mhm.
So God was trying to give them a clue as to what He would do the whole time.
every day wearing clothing is a reminder that you were covered because of your sin.
Yeah. Break down. There you go.
Yeah, but who thinks of that kind of stuff?
Us?
Nobody.
I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that the root word for cover is kafer. That's where we get that word. That's why we say the word cover the way we do, because it is that root word.
Far,
Yeah. Kafer, kafar, gopher wood was a
Gopher.
covering.
Gopher.
ransom, gopher.
But both gopher wood and kafer and kafar, both those words are the same root. It's hard to get all this Greek.
Stop speaking.
All right, I'll stop.
It's all the Hebrew there.
Sounds like you're clearing your throat no matter what.
Yeah. The one thing that was kind of interesting, at least interesting to me anyways, was I was looking at the root word for naked and for the word ashamed. And of course naked, at its root word means to be completely vulnerable, to be laid bare, like to be completely
Uncovered.
to be
Transparent.
completely uncovered.
Birthday scene.
Like that show Naked and Afraid.
Yeah, but this is naked and unafraid. You know, so
Naked and not.
so it's kind of interesting that there's that, and the word.
In our society today, would we find a time where most of us as adults would ever feel naked and unafraid?
Anytime you're naked, you're usually afraid.
Someone's gonna see you after you feel it.
Well, you have nothing to hide your weapon in. You can't protect yourself. There's nothing to hold on to.
And you usually go to jail.
If you're in public. But yeah, and the word for ashamed was kind of interesting. It just means like to be ashamed, but it was the word bush, which was kind of funny. It only sounded funny because that's what they hid in when they were ashamed.
Right.
So, bush. It's literally B-U-S-H. It's
Yeah.
The Bush family should be ashamed.
Yeah, probably.
Interesting. That would be that word.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting as we look at some of these words to go back and understand the roots, and we don't realize how much of what we say has derived out of Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's definitely one of the foundation points for what we believe today, so it would make sense. Yeah, so my next question to kind of bring it all together was to look at what kind of things we could observe about this kind of foundation thing in terms of what the elements of a biblical marriage would be, in terms of what makes it work. And so one of the observations that I'll bring out was that it started with Adam becoming, let's say, self-aware, right? Like, he was created and he was given his purpose, his mission, and he was kind of set in motion and ultimately, set up to realize that he was alone without somebody to be his counterpart. And so I think that just on the basis of Genesis, it seems like that's kind of one of the elements of what makes you ready for one, is when you realize you're in need of one. Does that sound like a logical conclusion? In a way?
That's part of what would make you ready for one, but there are some people that think they're ready for one when they're 12 years old.
Yeah. And some people might have been at 12. I mean, way back when. I mean, this years ago, that's what people did. I don't know what it was like, but I mean,
I was like in the 20s.
Try to imagine all the things, we take a lot of things for granted during our daily activities in terms of our routine. For example, we got up today out of a nice warm bed. We may have just went to the bathroom and brushed our teeth. We may have just went out and got something to drink and got some breakfast. Of course, we got taken a shower and gotten dressed and all those things. Just to try to imagine that you are Adam and Eve and it's day number 2. Now the Sabbath has passed because they were created on Friday evening. Probably the evening of probably the 6th day, and then right after that they probably celebrate the Sabbath Friday evening. And then you go through the whole experience of being with God for Sabbath, and then the next day begins. You got this whole world out there, right? But there's no running down to Kroger's or to the grocery store to say, or running to Hardee's to get breakfast. There's no
We wake up in Hardee's pretty much.
there's no vehicle,
Very
there's no
healthy
clothes, there's no pots and pans to make anything, there's no coffee maker, there's no anything, right?
Everybody's surviving.
Yeah, Sunday, what do you start with? How do you start on Sunday morning? You wake up and you
Fruit salad. There's nothing to cut it with.
Right, you have nothing to cut it with. Exactly. You just pick it off the tree and you're gonna eat it, right? With your hand. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you get to go try stuff and
if you're
get
gonna go to
some fruits and veggies.
you're gonna go to sleep that night, what are you gonna sleep in? Right? You're just gonna
I guess Adam may have wondered that first night, was he going to wake up and have another woman in the morning? I'm just saying.
I'm just trying to think outside the box a little bit. How the whole process of getting to know one another. I mean, he was getting to know the creation. Just by naming the animals.
Yeah.
But then
But basically, he put these two total strangers
right,
together in this world to discover things and
exactly. To discover how to do everything.
to create any kind of oneness out of that would definitely take time.
Yeah, I mean, how do you begin to make a home? Right? I mean, when people get together today, they have a party and they get gifts and they get things, that they can use to be a homemaker.
There's nobody to throw a housewarming party.
Well, I know, God and the angels could probably some kind of wild, crazy party, but that'd be the best party on record. But this whole growing up and maturing and educational process, we just take it all for granted.
Yeah, so one of the, this is the scripture I was talking about last week that I think is applicable to what you're saying there, where it says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter." Where it's like God created all this stuff, and you get the privilege and the joy of getting to figure out and discover and see what
Yeah.
amazing and interesting things the universe is.
And I think obviously it takes years for that to develop in a small way with our society today. We call it education and growing up and going to school and all that. But we typically we have things to work with along the way. We have things to relate to. We don't.
But the things we have to relate to are because we grew up with them.
Right.
They didn't grow up with them. They just were there. And anything that they
And there was
needed, they had to
nothing.
make it themselves or figure out a way to do it themselves.
I know when they Hollywood did the story of Noah's Ark, all of a sudden God gives them the word, and then the next scene, it's like Home Depot or Lowe's just showed up, and all these pallets of wood are sitting around, for them to use. That's not the way it was.
Well, you got to remember, though, being in that perfect environment, they didn't have a need for protection from the elements the way we do.
Correct.
So they didn't have to build a house with a roof on it
Or
or build a house at all. And there was no fear of any of the animals, so they didn't have to put walls up. What were they going to be afraid of?
And of course, you don't have any leaves because nothing has died to make or straw.
Well, the fig leaves that they used to make garments for themselves died.
Right. Well, I'm just saying you have to. Well, maybe I don't know. Well, after sin, yeah. But they probably had green palm fronds, and this is like the ultimate survival series going on here with.
It's truly Naked and Afraid, but they're going to put you in the most conducive environment for survival.
They're gonna put you in the best environment where there's no threat whatsoever, and you have to just live there.
Listen, if we were just dropped into a total wilderness, even with the insight that we already have, it would be a challenge to survive.
Today, yeah.
Today, it would be a challenge to survive. But here they start with, what insights do they have? You talk about oneness. It's like they have to rely on one another because there is nothing else.
But yet that reliance is without any fear or worry.
Right.
because they are all they have, and the animals are no threat, the birds are no threat. There is no fear or concern about anything that they want to do.
Mhm.
They just simply have to decide what they want to do.
Right, and of course that means deciding. I mean, there's no going to. Well, I mean, they went to, of course, commune with God on a daily and certainly a weekly.
That's the
basis.
first Hope Church.
The first home church is that absolutely right there. So,
Sorry.
and the congregation was the animals and nature was the congregation. But there's nobody to go out and win. Right? There's no motivation to try to win somebody to the Lord because everybody's all on the same page in that regard. It's just when you start thinking about the possibilities, it's amazing to see how their lives. It'd be interesting to sit down and talk with them at some point and say, "What did you do that first Sunday, that first day of and they'll say, well, the angels came and they set us down and they had the clipboard, and they said, this is what this is, and this is how you do this, and this is how you do that, and flip the chart over, and oh yeah, and we want you to be able to. You have to sleep so many hours a day.
I don't think the angels had to do any of that. I think it was all a very natural process.
I don't even know if it was inherent. I think it may have just been for the. I mean, because they were in a place where they had no fear of death, no fear of animal attacks.
But did they know they have to eat food and they have to drink plenty of water?
Instinctively, a baby knows they have to go to
But they
sleep.
did get to spend that first Sabbath with the Lord in the garden. I'm sure he showed them all the different fruits and things that were there to eat. I would imagine after he made them, he took them and showed them all the things.
So you didn't have an incredible mind.
Showed him chicken, and he said, "Chicken is delicious, but you're not supposed to eat it." So. I made my chicken very good, but don't touch it.
Leave the chicken alone.
You beget the thing that comes
Leave it
out of
alone,
its butt,
too.
you can eat that.
Yeah. But it's children, they go for it, man. No, yeah, so I think, I don't know, because I mean, I kind of always pictured it being something where, they were placed there, because I mean, God explains to Adam what his job is in the beginning. He kind of shows him the world, and he says, your job is to take care of this place and to make the rest of the world look like this place, and to be fruitful and have lots of children and fill this place up. So I feel like there were at least base level explanations.
I guess he had 9 months, assuming that the gestation period was the same as it is today. I'm guessing she had 9 months to learn what it would take to raise another human being. Or was it like it is today? You just learn as you go.
Well, given that. And I don't know if I can necessarily put the blame on how Cain turned out for their parenting, or whether that just boils down to personal choices. But I mean, like, is the way Cain turned out evidence that they were figuring stuff out?
He was the firstborn, and according to all that I've studied out, the reason for his obstinance was he was upset with God for evicting them from their garden home. He did not see that the penalty justified the crime. And so here was, I'm sure his parents, what were they telling him? How, of course, the Bible says that God kind of spoke to him directly too. Because he asked him, what have you done with your brother, etc. So how would they? Here's the first child in the world to be born. How do they know what to do? I'm sure, again, some of it was maternal. You have certainly a maternal instinct, and you certainly have respect for human life. You should have. That should just be normal, natural. Right, to have respect for life. Obviously, again, God had to be instructing them along the way. But again, personal free choice. And they're human beings. They have emotions, which means they can get angry, they can be sad, they can love, they can, all those emotional things can be there. You develop the right circumstances. and you could set somebody off if the potential is there. And you know, and of course, Cain may have been 100 years old when that happened. He may have killed his brother when he was 100.
Scott says the first sin must have happened soon after creation week since they had no kids yet.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know because one of the things that the Bible mentions being a result of sin is that he would increase a woman's conception. I think it says, right?
Cain.
I think it also says that it would increase her, not even just the pain being a thing, but I think it also said that she would also have like a higher likelihood of getting pregnant or being able to be pregnant sooner than normal.
It's because all the death that was going on.
Well, I mean, you know, because when you look at nature, most of nature is designed for like seasons of reproduction, as opposed to like a regular routine monthly time opportunity. And so one of the things I had read a while back anyways was that the theory was that human reproduction was actually like a seasonal thing as well, and that you could basically
Rather than every month it happened.
You could be fertile a certain time, and you could get pregnant then if you wanted to, you know. But that basically, since sin came in, death became a problem, and we needed to be able to have children sooner because of death. You know, that was just one theory. But I think
Because a lot of the recorded ones, they didn't have children. It doesn't record them having children until, 200, 300, 400 years old.
Well,
The later ones.
Cain came along supposedly when Adam was 130.
yeah. So
So that's Seth.
Verse 16 in Genesis 3 says, "Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception."
I mean, that's the result of sin, right?
Yeah. This is after they ate from the tree, and he's having the conversation
I
with
mean, more
them.
kids and more chance to have kids. I guess conception is more like, that's like the chance of having
At
kids.
least that he would multiply
Seth
her
came
sorrow
along.
and her conception.
When Adam was 130. So, I mean, like you said, the other ones there, a lot of them were, well over 100 before they even had kids.
Well, I had one of my teachers years ago said he suspected because
He's saying around
humans were much larger at that point and our life expectancy was longer,
316.
that women probably only had a cycle every year to year and a half,
I would say.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
rather than
There's no way for
monthly.
us to know
Yeah.
because as far as we know, 9 months has been the gestation period.
Well, 9 months may have been the gestation period, but that doesn't mean that a woman had a cycle every month necessarily.
Honestly.
Yeah.
He was saying he felt that the woman had a cycle maybe once a year rather than every calendar month.
Paradise. Right?
But PMS would be a real bite.
It's just been building up for 11 months. Yeah, but so
Yeah,
that's
it's hard to
just a
say.
theory that I've read. So.
Yeah. We don't know, but it's interesting to talk about it and think about that.
Yeah.
Definitely, it was a different world than anything we're used to.
I think it almost makes more sense because it's like there's nothing that's killing off humans. So why be so quick to multiply so fast? Because I mean, like with like cultures today, at the growth of like what they do, we like doubled our growth in like the span of like 100 years.
It seemed like 100.
That was. It was
like
like
the
crazy
Seth-
growth at a certain time.
Seth lived 105 years before he begot Enos. So it seems like, and of course, the other thing we have to consider is Seth wasn't Adam and Eve's first child.
It was the third, at least
we
the
don't
third.
know. They're only mentioning the boys. So we don't know if it was the actual third child or could have been more. So,
It was at least the one he wanted to mention.
well, it was the one that was like him after his likeness. And that's God made one after his likeness, made Adam.
Then he made man to procreate after his likeness.
And man just went on down. But Seth is the one that carried the line of righteousness on. And that's why you have the ones mentioned. But they aren't necessarily the firstborn. So,
Scott says gestation period is 40 weeks, like 40 years in the wilderness.
yeah.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
40 is is.
It would be a wilderness. It would be been a wilderness for Eve. I mean, to be going through that whole experience for the first time, and then not have any idea. I mean, she didn't have any other women to ask what's normal when you're expecting a baby. What's normal when the time
The
comes.
angels don't procreate, so
Right.
So they can't
don't.
empathize or tell you. Or,
Yeah, they don't. But obviously, God, I'm sure. He created men to be a blessing to himself, and so he was going to give them all the insight that they needed for sure. It's just interesting to try to think it through, of what they went through and how they went through it.
I think too that I've always approached it from the standpoint of what was God's plan originally. You know, when we had our kids, and I was learning about when to feed them, and you start off with nursing, but when do you introduce them to solid food? Well, you think about what would have happened in the garden when you didn't have anything. You had no cooked foods, you had no baby foods, you had no prepared anything. You obviously couldn't give a baby much of the fruits that grow because they had no teeth, they had no ability to chew anything. And it's interesting that about the time a baby starts teething and cutting those first teeth, they found that the enzymes are produced to digest solid food, which is between 6 and 8 months. So that's the point at which you could introduce.
I bet it didn't take you long to learn that lesson.
But it's just interesting that if you look at it from a natural perspective, what would have been natural back then? And so when you look at that, when you're raising your family, then you can be a little more logical about it rather than going by what all these books and things say. I had people told me, oh, you need to start them on cereal at three weeks, and get them to sleep through the night by starting them. And I thought, no, they don't have anything to digest it with. They only need mama's milk for a while. But the logical, and at about that age where those digestive enzymes kick in and they're starting to teeth, they inherently start putting things in their mouth and tasting things. Up until that time, they really don't do it. So it's almost like God
Bugs,
programmed
whatever they
this.
can grab.
Oh yes, bugs especially. It was fun watching you guys grow up. Trust me.
I bet.
Mm.
So there's lots of interesting points there. I guess to kind of round it out, the three points that I kind of gathered from.
Oh dear, what happened? Oh.
Supposed to use an oven mitt for that.
Well, we have oven mitts, but they suck. So.
Yes.
Anyways.
Time for new oven mitts. Put
Just,
that on my list.
So, like, three of the points that I think I was observing as I was studying in wrapping this up for today. We can talk more about that next week. Is like I said, the knowledge of self. Becoming self-aware, having an idea of what your purpose, your direction is, things like that. And I think these things help set us in motion for when we feel we're ready to get married, as well as helping us maintain a marriage. I think the second point to that is the knowledge of your partner. I think it's in 1 Peter it says to dwell with your wives according to knowledge, which is a very interesting statement. But I think that deals with knowing your partner and knowing their direction. And where I'm gathering all this from is the little things like Adam being shown what his mission and purpose was in this earth, and then being shown Eve, who was completely bare before him. Before each other. So I think that's what I'm thinking when I'm talking about knowledge of your partner. Is it's a complete transparency between two people of everything that you are.
They were both vulnerable to
They were both vulnerable and completely open and without guilt.
Without self-consciousness.
Without
They were
self-consciousness.
actually focused on each other.
Yeah.
And that's a really important point when you focus on each other and you're not sitting there saying, well, do I look good? Do I feel good? Or any of that other stuff.
He looks good.
Yes.
She looks good.
And they were looking at each other, rather than looking at themselves.
Mhm.
And we've got a whole society right now that's all built on looking at self. Because you're worth it. I deserve it.
Yeah.
It's all about me, me, me. And it's not about serving others.
I don't think the percentage would have to be pretty low of people today when they get married that are thinking of those things and are ready for marriage. I think most people who get married today, they're on the
Most marriages are formed out of selfishness, just like the story of Samson. She looks good, get her for me. That's the way most marriages are pursued. And they don't think about any of the ramifications of what's involved in being partners, being lovers, being friends, all of those things.
Society has a lot to play in that part. Of course, the Hollywood and movies and all that, they set this perception up, that people kind of buy into it, but it's not reality. And all of a sudden, they down the road a year or 2, 3, 5, whatever, they wake up and think, what in the world?
What did I marry?
So, it's...
And I think that also comes back around to that idea of having knowledge of self, but also knowledge of your partner. Because when you can go into something and everything is completely open between two people, then you can really have what I think is kind of the final element that makes up a biblical marriage, and that is actual unity. True unity. Because if there's a disconnect on any side of that, there can't be unity. I think that's one of the challenges and beautiful and very interesting things about marriage, is it's two completely different people trying to be completely vulnerable, loving, and open with each other. And I think that's a very hard thing to do. So those are some observations, and we can kind
A
of...
lot more to talk about next week, don't we?
Yeah, so like I said, the topic pretty much starts off tiny and then just keeps branching out into huge portions of, study.
Well, all society's built on really family unit.
But the devil's trying to undo that.
Yeah, of course that has to be under severe attack, because divide and conquer, that's the whole plan.
Susan says that vulnerability between Adam and Eve was as God wanted it to be.
Actually, it's unite and conquer.
That's a place of absolute trust. When you have that kind of vulnerability, where you can trust the other person. You don't expect them to hurt you, and you don't expect them to do anything, dishonoring. You really have a great relationship there.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. That's that trust, that this person in front of you is for you. I mean, they were literally for each other. But and of course things are very different now. They had the ideal, perfect situation, the perfect marital situation. And now we have sin to contend with, and it's a much more complex
It's a lot more work
issue.
to keep a marriage going now than it was back then.
Oh yeah, but I think in a way it's a lot more rewarding too, because then you can kind of you can see, because it, just like Dad's always saying, it really paints the picture of the atonement process and how God would redeem humanity in that same struggle of God trying to unify Himself with us and us trying to unify ourselves with Him. We're trying to replicate that same experience here on earth before we get to heaven with each other. So, on that note, we will close and we'll pick it up next week and talk more about all that. We'll pray. Father, thank you so much for this day, for this family time that we've got to be together and to study more about marriage and to learn about these beautiful things that you've left for us to learn. We ask that as we study more in the coming Sabbaths that you would give us more insight, more understanding, and help us all to be personally benefited, help our marriages to grow and to be blessed by you. Help us to have marriages that really show the character of your Son, and help us all to be your examples here on earth for all that would live ungodly. And bless the time that we have together as we eat, and bless those who are watching with us online, that they receive some spiritual food with us as well. So this we ask and pray, and we thank you in the name of your Son. Amen.
Good. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll catch you here again next Sabbath.
Scott says God chose Eve for Adam, and He chose us to be the bride of Christ. What an honor.
Anyway.